Welcome, everyone, to the book launch for British Writers, Popular Literature, and New Media Innovation, 1820 to 45. So this book, yay, came out in the spring of 2024. I couldn't be more excited about it and to share with you, along with my contributors, some of the insights from this volume. So I'm going to begin with a short introduction to the book as a whole, and then we'll have 5-minute presentations from 8 of our 12 contributors, but that should leave plenty of time for your questions. So please take note of questions that you might have that you can share when we get to that portion of the program, okay? All right, so the period between 1820 and 1845 is often interpreted as a transitional and unremarkable phase between the Romantic and Victorian eras. Yet when viewed from a media history perspective, a different narrative emerges. The early 19th century was a period of new media innovation, an era that produced a wide variety of book, periodical, and newspaper formats that were available to a larger and more diversified reading public than ever before. The efflorescence of print culture during this era was enabled by the rise of popular literature and education movements, as well as the expansion of rail networks, advancements in printing and papermaking technology, and a reduction in the stamp duty in 1836. During this period, publishers not only experimented with serial formats, from penny papers to part publication of novels such as Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, but also explored synergies between text and image, producing, for example, the elegant steel-cut engravings of literary annuals and the innovative woodcut illustrations incorporated into children's books and comic magazines. So while today we might associate new media with digital technologies, new media innovation has a long history that precedes and in many ways anticipates the present moment. During the early decades of the 19th century, innovation and unruliness were produced not only through competition for new readerships, but also through practices of scissors and paste reprinting and the pirating of content enabled by ambiguities in international copyright law. It was a media ecology, much like our own, that was fueled by innovation and competition, as well as anxiety about the status of writers and readers in a time of accelerating social change. At the same time that publishers developed new book and periodical formats designed to appeal to modern readers, they adapted old media forms to new publishing contexts. By adapting old media and inventing the new, publishers, editors, artists, and writers contributed to a print culture that was more robust and expansive than ever before. By mid-century, the habit of reading had become part of everyday life for a wide range of readers, including women, children, activists, clerks, and the lower classes. The 12 chapters in this collection are intended to promote greater understanding of this period as an era of innovation in 19th century print culture. This included experimentation with new publication formats, the reinvention and remediation of older forms, and the definition of new kinds of contributors and audiences for print. The chapters in this collection are by no means intended to cover all genres, writers, and themes during these decades, or to provide a comprehensive overview of the period. Rather, each chapter is designed as a case study that models ways of entering into a vast field of study, drawing attention to the interactivity of readers, editors, publishers, and print forms in a period of unprecedented change. So I will now share my screen. So there you have the list of presenters for today. So when I took on this editorial project, I was eager to secure the very best junior and senior scholars working in this early period of media history. And I was fortunate indeed to receive contributions from the scholars whose names appear on this slide. So today we're going to proceed in the order that you see there. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to share some highlights from their chapter. And after everyone is done, then we will have plenty of time for your questions. during the Q&A. I also want to note other contributors to the volume who could not be here today or are here and not presenting. We have Mark Turner, Chris Haffenden, Sarah Maurer, and Richard Salmon, and you see the titles of their chapters here on the slide. So without further ado, we will now move on to our first presenter, who is Brian Maidment. So Brian is Emeritus Professor of the History of Print at Liverpool John Moores University, and the title of his chapter is Mirth and Fun, the Comic Annual and the New Graphic Humor of the 1830s.
Alexis, just really quickly, I'm going to pop in. Oh, there we go. Yeah, because it had gone. Yeah.
All right, so we'll hand it over to Brian.
Brian, you're on. Yeah, you're on.
Oh, I'm on. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Just following up really what Alexis was saying, my piece on comic annuals is part of a long campaign to explore the way in which the 1820s and 1830s were awash with graphic images, really not the black hole of traditional narratives between the death of caricature and the launch of Punch and the Illustrated London News and the Penny Magazine. But the 1820s and 30s, restless, inventive, varied, a parade of visual invention. Now, I think the first thing I wanted to say was that is now much more recognized than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that's really important. People are beginning to make sense of this massive stuff. And just talking about mass, I've been doing some work on popular lithographs recently, well, not necessarily at the bottom of the market, but there were over 45, possibly 50 long-running series, some of them containing 80 lithographs in it, enormous numbers. No collection can represent that, very difficult to actually get a sense of just how enormous this area is. What I've been interested by is the way in which a number of recent publications on the 1830s, books of essays, have begun to include visual material. There's a volume produced by the Year's Work in English Studies a few years ago, Alexis's book, of course, and the new Cambridge Gardner Stewart collection from Cambridge University Press, all have focused pieces on graphic culture. And they're really building. I think we've now got something of a base. Ian Haywood's Rise of Victorian Caricature has been important in that. Dare I say it, but I think my own work has had some influence on this as well. But the new thing is really that people like Claire Pettit in Serial Forms and Rachel Tchaikovsky in Picture World and Mary Shannon are now beginning to use this material in ways that I think are really quite brilliantly constructive. So it's a good moment to be interested in these things. I don't want to say a lot about my piece, just a couple of things. The center of it is a meditation on modes of humor and the way that these might be changing in the 1820s and 30s and how that might be visible in graphic text. I'm leaving the word illustration on one side very carefully at the moment. And the piece I've written basically argues that there's a shift from ideas of mirth to ideas of fun. And that essentially, I think, is a move away from satire. It's a move away from kinds of humor that were purposive to kinds of humor that were more leisure-based. And I think that's quite an important shift, although I'm not sure I've got it right or fully understand it yet. The second thing I got very interested in was the engagement with the printed word that you find in comic prints of all kinds. They are full of a critique, a pastiche, an attack even on words. Many of the series of graphic images are constructed as dictionaries or in various alphabets, various ways in which words, the letter, the printed text are constructed. And I'm really interested in the extent to which graphic illustration, comic graphic illustration at this period engages with and puts printed texts, I think, to the sword. And the third theme that I just want to talk about is the texts I look at. I'm not clear that they are illustrated in quite the way we mean that. And that's a whole issue about how much autonomy does the image have. A lot of the kinds of things I look at, including the comic annuals, actually are meant to be scanned for their graphic content as much as anything else. And there are full page images, often not associated with text. So this whole issue of, are images fighting back? Are they wanting to retain some sort of autonomy? And of course, that kind of goes away by the time you get to Pickwick. And just as a coda to what I want to say, all the comic annuals described in my chapter are on their way the week after next to the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale, who've taken a huge chunk of 1820s, 30s illustrated stuff from Southport in Merseyside to deepest Connecticut. And I'm very pleased they're going there. They'll all be scanned, they'll all be online, free to use, that wonderful resource that the Lewis Walpole represents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. All right, our next speaker is Linda K. Hughes, who's Addie Levy Professor of Literature Emerita at Texas Christian University. And the title of her talk is Fauna, Flora, an Illustrated Verse in Mary Howitt's Environmental Children's Poetry. And just give me a second to get your slides.
And while you are doing that, I apologize that I'm invisible. It's not that I'm being shy, nor am I ungroomed, but I am sitting atop a mountain above Boulder, Colorado, and I'm using a laptop I don't usually use, and my camera isn't working, so apologies for that. Okay. Howitt demands inclusion in this volume because she was an important new media innovator from the 1820s to the 1840s, including in her multimodal poetry volume for children, Sketches of Natural History, published in 1834. She claimed it was inspired by the family's interaction with another multimodal text, which most of us will know from Jane Eyre, if no other source, Thomas Bewick's Illustrated History of British Birds, first published in 1797. Bewick's woodcuts enabled text and image to appear on the same page in an interactive visual and ideational relationship that invited reader participation. Howitt's husband, William, exemplified this aim, since he entertained the Howitt children by making up tales inspired by tailpiece vignettes in Bewick's book. Howitt's poetic sketches extended the family practice. As she explained, quote, "My little poetical sketches had reference to Bewick's woodcuts of birds and animals and were written down because the children liked them," close quote. Sketches of Natural History also built upon Howitt's participation in multimodal literary annuals, which became fashionable with Rudolf Ackermann's Forget-Me-Not, founded in 1823. Slide change, please. Here you can see the end of Howitt's most famous poem today, The Spider and the Fly, which first appeared in the 1829 New Year's Gift and Juvenile Souvenir with a rather incongruous tailpiece. Howitt felt that children's books should inspire delight and curiosity rather than rigid moral lessons. And next slide, her 1834 poems, here you see the title page and frontispiece, declined to wrench her subject matter into religious or moral didacticism. At their best, they anticipate elements of contemporary environmental writing in viewing fauna and flora as co-inhabitants of Earth of full worth unto themselves, apart from any human use except the delight of reading about them. And as a single example from a larger chapter, I was struck on first acquaintance at the joy she conveyed in the unlikely topic, next slide please, of the water rat, with engravings by Ebenezer Landless, an initial proprietor of Punch, who had been apprenticed to Thomas Bewick at 14. Landless' illustration images the water rat in an ecosystem environed by flora, fauna, note the birds and ducks in the sky, and water, a point extended by the poem, since the poem, too, represents not a solitary animal, but an ecosystem. And I'm going to read a few lines as a way of giving the flavor of it. So next slide, please. A little field stream overshadowed with trees, where the water is clear as a free mountain rill, and now it runs rippling, and now it is still. There I'll show you the brown water rat at display. You will see nothing blither this blithe summer day. A glad, innocent creature for whom was ordained the quiet of brooks and the plants they contain. Next slide. There is one disruptive note, but hush, step as lightly as leaves in their fall. Man has wronged him, and he is in fear of us all. And note that us. It's not a singular person, it is all of humanity. Next slide. But she goes back to the eco-environment of the water rat. For he has not a want which he cannot supply in a water like this with these water plants nigh, and he asketh no bounty from man. He can find a plentiful table spread out to his mind, for this little field stream hath all good that he needs. Okay, next slide. And I'm not going to read this next one, but you can see that it's about how, again, even in winter, the water rat can slip into his little cave and Mother Earth will take care of him. So next slide, please. In many ways, no, back one, please. There's my conclusion. Nope, forward, there. I'm wanting just the illustration. Okay, very good. In many ways, the pure, disinterested joy and gladsome recognition of a fellow earthly creature is this poem's ecological message, and check to human urges to place itself at the center of nature and all creation, and or to continue its unconsidered depredations on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Our next speaker is Jennie Batchelor, who is head and professor of English and related literature at the University of York. So her chapter is titled Keeping Pace with the Growing Spirit of the Times, the Women's Magazine in Transition. Jennie?
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you. I'm so excited and honored to be here and to be in this volume, not least because of all the wonderful contributors who are also in it, but also because writing this essay was a great opportunity for me to think further about, and ultimately I found myself rethinking some of the previous research that I'd done about Romantic era women's magazines, in particular the Ladies magazine, but others as well. The Ladies magazine, as you might know, its conventional periodization is 1770 through 1832, but because it merged first with the Ladies Museum and then the Belle Assemblée, it has a kind of afterlife, as it were, till 1847. And I've become increasingly interested through writing this piece on that period between 1820 and 1847. So I guess in my previous work that I'd done on the magazine, I'd been very interested in what happened to the Ladies magazine, particularly as it responded in its later years to growing changes and shifts in the market and to a growing number of very tenacious rivals that became very vexatious to it. And many of the changes that happened, particularly from about 1815, and especially from 1820 onwards, especially the change that it made in its business model, whereby previously, and in its first 3 decades, most of its original content had been written by its readers, to a more professionalized kind of business model. This marks such a significant departure from what made the magazine so very innovative when it first started in 1770, that I think early on in my research on the magazine, and even in the first draft of the book I wrote about it, I very much sort of felt that from 1820 onwards, the magazine was entering a period of kind of terminal compromise, if you like, or decline. And what was so wonderful to me in revisiting this and other of its rivals for this essay was that I started to really rethink that in relation to the claims that Alexis highlighted at the beginning of this launch about the innovation in this period. So instead of thinking about what happened to the Ladies magazine, I became much more interested in what the Ladies magazine was making happen. And so the essay is very much one which is about how those shifts and changes that Alexis has outlined, how that competition led to the magazine developing a whole series of innovations. The quotation that's in the title about keeping pace with the spirit of the times is taken from the 1820 prospectus for the Ladies magazine. And 1820 was a very auspicious year for the Ladies magazine because it marked not only its 50th year of publication, but also the launch of its new series. Lots of changes in its format and structure, its production values, and its literal and metaphorical feel. It's a different thing in your hands than it was before that. And a number of improvements that it initiated. So in the essay, what I try and do, and I'll just give you a sense of its contours, and then hopefully some of you might want to read it. I sort of pay attention to some of the particular changes that emerged in response to the wider media ecology of the time. And I'm very interested in situating the magazine, which has always been, women's magazines have often been seen as a kind of parallel or sort of subgenre to other kinds of magazines. And I'm very much interested in the dialogue and interaction between the women's magazine and literary magazines. There's lots about its very vexatious relationships between the women's magazine and Blackwood's. The various marriages, which is not my term, it's a term the Ladies magazine uses, to other kinds of periodical formats. So the Ladies magazine for a long time becomes the companion to the annuals. Not least because for a big part of the magazine's later history, its editor is Charles Heath, something that's often not documented in accounts of Heath's publishing career. I'm interested in its relationship with Le Follet, which becomes a kind of magazine within the magazine in its later years. 3 decades before Samuel Beeton is engaged in a similar relationship with subsequent publications by the Le Follet's later editors. And I'm also very, very interested in the ways in which women writers particularly played such an important role in forging ahead with these innovations. So I talk a little bit about Barbara Hofland, whose husband was also very important in the magazine and curating its sort of fine art section. But I also do a lot of, I pay some attention to Mary Russell Mitford, who was absolutely key to the success of the magazine in that period. But the Ladies magazine is very much my case study. What I'm trying to do here is to make a bigger claim about how these 2.5 decades are a really important milestone in the history and development in the women's magazine as we come to know it later in the 19th century and into the 20th, and to see how that evolution happens through a series of really innovative, experimental attempts by under the leadership of various editors and kind of market changes. So just to kind of conclude, I'll just say a little bit from the actual essay itself. My ultimate argument, I guess, then is, well, new technologies and the various socioeconomic factors, undoubtedly account for the women's magazine's greater reach and market share, formally, materially, stylistically, and culturally. The women's magazine becomes a genre whose parameters and commercial viability were wrestled into existence by the innovative contributors, editors, artists, and publishers of the early 19th century periodical marketplace. So I very much want to kind of reinstate the 1820s and 30s, not just in sort of scholarship more widely, but it's really helped me rethink this period, which I've often seen as a kind of dead zone in some ways in kind of women's periodical history. And I'm starting to see it differently. So thank you to Alexis for giving me the opportunity to realize I was very wrong.
Thank you so much, Jennie. All right, our next speaker is Kaylee Enos, who is Professor of Literature and Composition at the College of the Rockies. And the title of her talk is Beyond the Literary Annuals, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Elizabeth Landon, and Periodical Poetry. She does have some slides that I'm going to share.
Very minimal. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that I'm privileged to do this work on the traditional unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and Kinbasket peoples, where I live. And while this is an area that is very rich in mountains and lakes and deer who eat all your flowers, it is very poor in access to 19th century periodicals. So I want to start off by just acknowledging that my chapter is, I guess, doubly new media in the sense that I am indebted to the current index and the, make sure I get the title right, Allison, the Digital Victorian Periodical Poetry site for allowing me to do this kind of research in a very rural, isolated area. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So I always like to start my work by looking at a poem or a text that speaks to kind of the more specific issues that I'm looking at. And I came across this poem from Blackwoods by Robert McNish. And it's a kind of, it's called Poetical Portraits. And it's this essentially like gallery that he creates of these little portraits of British authors. And I found that it was very interesting that on the first page of this collection of poems, we have Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, and then on the other side, you can kind of see at the bottom, Hemans, Tye, and Landon. And so I felt this was very interesting or very fitting for my chapter, focusing on Landon and Hemans, in that it kind of identifies or is showing how, at least in the periodical culture of the era, these kind of traditionally somewhat marginalized in scholarship female poets are placed alongside some of the like big names in British literary history, canonical figures, as well as some of their male contemporaries, that there is no separation, there's a lack of hierarchy, and that this text here, at least initially, seems to challenge critical divisions of popular and canonical literature that we have today, by asserting the cultural and literary relevance of Hemans and Landon, and I would argue the poetess tradition they represent. It also serves to place them at the center of a growing new media culture of the early 19th century, published as it is in Blackwoods magazine. So my contribution more specifically in this collection builds on the recent influx of scholarship that is studying the intersection of new media forms and the development of women's poetry and the public figure of the poetess. In particular, I really consider how the recirculation of Hemans and Landon's poetry in Chambers' Edinburgh Journal between 1832 and 1841 simultaneously anticipates and contributes to the rise of the family literary periodical and its poetics mid-century. We can move on to the next slide. So during the period I examine, Hemans appears in Chambers 15 times, and I've just listed all of the poems in chronological order there in case anyone is interested. Landon appears twice. I read this difference as being significant, and I first read it in light of Meredith McGill's contention that the culture of reprinting suspends, reconfigures, and intensifies the authority of the author. Specifically, my analysis of Heman and Landon's contributions to Chambers focuses on the way in which Landon's relative absence resonates against the positioning of Hemans as the representative female poet in Chambers. She, for that time period under consideration, she is the female poet who has published the most by a significant number. And I think she is one of the top 4 poets that appear in the periodical during that period. So this tale of 2 poetesses, I suggest, reinforces the centrality that I had never thought of before of Heman's poetic and persona to the development of new media forms and periodical poetry in the early 19th century, especially as it concerns female readers and writers. So the editors of Chambers, my chapter explores how they effectively reconfigured the poetry of Hemans and Landon to transform it into kind of what I consider to be representative examples of the type of verse appropriate for both the aspiring readers and aspiring writers of the middle classes. sorry, that wasn't aspiring readers, it's just the readers and aspiring writers. Moreover, the poems selected for republication function to, I think, further support claims of the publication's morality and propriety, which becomes really important as the family magazine really starts circulating and taking root. And it is here that Heman and Landon's reputations make a difference to their circulation and reproduction. And I'm just going to talk about that for a few minutes or a minute or two, just because it's my favorite part of the chapter, I think. So the paratextual attributions offered by the editors of Chambers for Heman's poem tend to emphasize her cultural capital, and they tend to kind of focus on her domestic identity. With Landon, they call her the lamentable, what was the actual phrase? The lamented Lel. So really emphasizing her position as the doomed poetess. And so I just think that when we're talking about how they're represented, right, it's obvious that Heman's is held up as the model for a poetess and Landon is not. Anyway, there's obviously a lot more to be said, but I just kind of end my chapter with the suggestion that studying the recirculation of Heman's and Landon's poetry provides one window into how both the poetry and myths surrounding them as opposite models of female authorship and celebrity provide evidence of the existence of a concrete, traceable transition from the new media culture of the late Romantic era to that of the mid-19th century.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Helena Goodwin, who is assistant professor at Northumbria University. And the title of her talk, her chapter, I should say, is A Familiar Transition, Dinah Mulock Craik's Early Career in Periodicals, 1841 to 45.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted myself and hadn't. Yes, like others, I really want to begin by thanking Alexis for the opportunity to be a part of this volume with such an amazing group of scholars, and of course to RSVP for hosting this wonderful event. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces. So yeah, as Alexis said, my chapter is entitled A Familiar Transition, Dinah Mulock Craik's Early Career in Periodicals, 1841 to 45. So you can see I'm sort of squeaking in there towards the end of the sort of parameters of the volume. And with this chapter, I was kind of attempting to defamiliarize what we think of as a familiar narrative about how women entered into publishing in the first half of the 19th century by looking at Dinah Maria Mulock as she was then, and her first steps into this popular literature marketplace. And what was an interesting exercise for me, I was sort of listening to Jennie there, it really chimed with me, putting this chapter together and restricting myself to the first 4 years of Mulock's publishing career. It gave me an opportunity to challenge some of my own assumptions about the difficulties a young woman might face in attempting to launch herself into, you know, an already highly competitive periodical industry. And it was refreshing, actually, to chart the kind of self-assuredness that Mulock possessed even at the age of 14, when her first poem was published in the Staffordshire Advertiser. Her belief that she should be published and her unhappiness when she was represented as a kind of precocious child by several of her earliest editors surprised me. And as I've said, it enabled me to kind of rethink some of those powerful stereotypes about the Victorians, you know, and gender iniquities of the period. That's not to say that I'm arguing that there weren't huge gender-based disparities in the 19th century. Of course there were, but Dinah Mulock's move from a relatively sheltered early girlhood in a part of England known as the Potteries to London in 1840 sees her transformed into an accomplished performer and published author, seemingly unfazed by, you know, the sort of teeming metropolis, all in the space of a few years. And there's something admirably, dare I say, arrogant, even about her early life in periodicals. Her father places her first poem in a local newspaper, as I just mentioned, the Staffordshire Advertiser, in 1841. She's only 14. And the editor adds a note. We insert the above lines at the request of a correspondent who informs us that they are the production of a young lady in her 14th year only. And Moloch is mortified, right? She writes to her childhood friend about how vexed she is at this editorial insertion. And she felt it really did the poem a disservice to be framed in this way, but it didn't put her off, crucially. So 9 months later, in October of that year, she's now 15, we get another poem in the Dublin University magazine. And as I say in the chapter, this is quite a graduation from a local newspaper managed by a family friend to an expensive, thoroughly middle-class monthly magazine, quoting the our well-loved dictionary here, with substantial general articles and reviews section intended for, a kind of relatively well-educated reader. But we get another editorial note. Our next is from the pen of another fair authoress. When we inform our readers that she does not yet number 16 years, we're sure they will agree with us that the following gives promise of future powers, which only require study of the art, careful examination of the best models, and a little more discipline and knowledge to attain fame and distinction. Now, I don't have an accompanying letter from Moloch to anyone about this, but I think it's fair to assume she would have been raging. Over the next few years, she publishes 12 more poems in Friendship's Offering of Sentiment and Mirth. And confusingly, I'm now talking about a different Belle Assemblée to Jennie, the new monthly, before she begins to branch out into translation and short story writing. So by the end of 1845, when our volume draws to a close, Moloch has 17 poems and 4 stories in translation under her belt, several of these featuring in chambers, already mentioned both the journal and the miscellany. And there are, perhaps other unattributed works out there still to be discovered. My chapter takes pains to examine Moloch's transitioning to the world of letters quite closely, demonstrating that she moved incrementally, right? So establishing herself by skillfully combining her originality and innovative ideas with familiar, established literary modes and models. She then moves to translation, a process that required really, great skill and impressive knowledge of the nuances of foreign languages and an eye for trends in the market for popular literature. From there, she takes that larger leap to novellas and the 3-volume novel. As our much missed Sally Mitchell writes of Moloch Craik, in contrast to the images put forward by the society she lived in, Craik's world is strikingly non-patriarchal. So it's, her literary creations rejected the idea that women face a world that say women should be protected, fixed in childish dependency. And I have to think that Moloch Craik would have been rather relieved and perhaps even pleased with this critical understanding of her, even if it came 100 years too late for her to enjoy it.
Thank you, Helena. Our next speaker is Sophia Prado-Huggins, who is project manager for the Uproot Project. The title of her chapter is Paratextual Navigation, Positions of Witnessing in the Anti-Slavery Reporter.
Hi, everyone. I want to echo those that came before me and thank Alexis for including me in this volume and RSVP for putting together this awesome event. My chapter focuses on the anti-slavery reporter in 1831, and it looks at the space of the page and takes on a very granular approach to the idea of new media by focusing on how the different paratextual elements on a page position the reader within the act of reading the periodical itself, but also within the larger global geographical context. And in this essay, I specifically focus on the way that the editors of the Anti-Slavery Reporter, which were Zachary McCulley and Thomas Pringle, used a lot of colonial material in the periodical. So so I specifically look at how they use a lot of excerpts from the Christian Record, which was published by Edward Jordan and Robert Osborne, who were 2 free Black men of color in Jamaica. And they also published the Jamaica Watchman. The anti-slavery reporter relied heavily on this colonial material. I look at the ways that paratextual elements, such as footnotes, take that material from the colonies and reassert the importance of Britain for the reader. Although the anti-slavery reporter was edited and printed in London, the periodical depended on this global information and production network that is very similar to how digital new media works today. And it encourages readers to function as witnesses. And when I talk about witnessing in this context, I'm talking about this in the tradition of Black women's critical theory, how witnessing how witnessing makes the act of the witness more important than the actual suffering of the Black enslaved. Understood geographically, the accents on the page, such as footnotes or chapter headings or asterisks, they transported the evidence from the colonies to Britain, where readers could appropriate it and transform themselves from passive recipients of this information to witnesses whose testimony condemned slavery in the court of public opinion. And so my larger project argues that we can read periodical pages as sort of textual maps that where the paratextual elements suggest ways of reading for the reader that position themselves within this emerging geopolitical framework that is happening in the 1820s and 30s. These periodicals assisted in the creation of a new and at times revolutionary terrain, and then used the content and paratextual elements to suggest how readers could situate themselves therein. In the early 1830s, readers engaged with the reporter, and I would argue with other periodicals of the time, as a navigational tool, and one that helped them to position themselves in relation to critical political issues of the time, while also simultaneously shaping their beliefs about the place about Britain's place in the emerging world order.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Françoise Baillet, whose chapter is titled Invincible Brothers, The Pen and the Press in the Compositor's Chronicle, 1840 to 43.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I'm also very honored to be part of this collection, and I'm very grateful to you as editor of the collection, and also very happy to see you all. I wanted to apologize in advance because I've managed to catch a cold in August. So if I start coughing, I'm really apologizing about this. Try not to. Okay, so my chapter approaches the concept of new media innovation and its impact on print culture through the example of a trade journal, the Compositor's Chronicle. So the Compositor's Chronicle was the main organ of the London Union of Compositors, and it circulated between September 1840 and August 1843, later replaced by the Printer and Compositors and Pressmen's Chronicle. Now, during the period under consideration, I mean, this particular period, 1840, 1843, but also within the period approached by our collection, that is to say 1820, 1845, of course, as we know, printing evolved from an artisan craft into a massively mechanized large-scale industry. And within the same time, of course, workers' organization evolved from chapels into local typographical societies, and then later on regional and later national unions. So across the United Kingdom, of course, because of all these changes, because of the introduction of new machinery like the piano type, the Young and Delcambre type printing machine, because of the introduction also of female labor into the composing room, because of all these evolutions, a lot of compositors felt threatened. Now, of course, professionally threatened, and in the pages of the Compositor's Chronicle, well, this threat is dealt with in different ways. And the object of this essay is to examine, I have written before about the Compositor's Chronicle, about the political articles, about the leading articles, but here, of course, I chose to focus on the literary input, the way in which prose, the way in which poetry could have been harnessed by the Compositor's Chronicle to deal with these subjects, but also at the same time to rewrite the printers into highly respectable, literate, sociable readers and consumers. Of course, at a time in between the first Reform Act and the second Reform Act, at a time when, of course, many of printers were still disenfranchised. So to do so, to try to focus on these questions, I have made a selection of 30 items in prose, items in verse, original or reprinted from various sources, as of course was very common at the time. So I've divided my corpus into two different categories. A first category concerns the series of moral and philosophical essays. So that's basically the first part of the essay. And the second part is devoted to the Chronicle's poetry. So just a few words about the first part. In the Compositor's Chronicle, there were a lot of these philosophical essays, broaching a number of subjects, a few examples, the beauties of nature. So that's a series which ran from December 1840 until July 1841. The Recollections of an Old Bailey Barrister, very humorous, very funny. I advise that very much, from 1840 until 1843. And my point in working on these prose essays is that of course, literary conventions are really harnessed in these essays to really present political points about women, for instance, or to rewrite printers into very respectable figures. The second section investigates the Chronicle's poetry. You have, of course, in the Chronicle's poetry, a number of very conventional poems about feelings, about love, about pets, about mourning, but also, and quite surprisingly, a number of radical poems. And I worked in the final section of my essay on these radical poems, these excerpts from, for instance, Victoria, a Political Poem, which was published by Richard Waymis. And all these excerpts are used and are put in relation within the Compositor's Chronicle on the page in relation to other articles about the unions. I think it's been 5 minutes, so I'm very grateful for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Françoise. Our final speaker today is Elizabeth Howard, who is Assistant Professor of English at Bethlehem College. And the title of her chapter is Periodical as Memorial, Remembering Felicia Hemans in the New Monthly Magazine, 1835. And I do have a slide to share.
Perfect. Thanks, Alexis. And again, thanks to RSVP for hosting and the other contributors. So my chapter is actually is in dialogue, though obliquely, with Kaylee Ennis's chapter on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as well as Letitia Landon and Hemans, except I am in a different periodical. I'm looking very carefully at New Monthly Magazine and considering an event, namely the death of Felicia Hemans, and asking what happens in the periodical in a moment, particularly in the 1820s and 30s, when we're asking, what does it mean for an author to be a living author? What does it mean for writing to be lively? And then what does it mean for someone to die and to commemorate them? So what happens when Hemans dies in 1835 in a specific periodical? So I took the oft oft debated commemorative chain for Felicia Hemans, and decided rather than swooping across time and spaces to look at a specific space, one periodical, New Monthly Magazine. And what I discovered was that there's actually a serial commemoration to Hemans across genres, everything from the obituary to the commemorative verse that we're familiar, many of us familiar with, from Landon and Barrett Browning, as well as we have commemorative busts showing up in a otherwise not illustrated magazine, all of these genres working together, and it creates a space for the periodical mourning as early as the 1830s. So I know April Patrick has done work on Dickens dying. How does the periodical mourn Dickens? But way earlier in the century, what forms does the periodical use in concert, seriality becoming a way of mourning? So you can see on my slide here the consecutive issues, literally without pause, for 6 months. We mourn Hemans in New Monthly Magazine. June, we have the announcement of her death. July, we have Landon's stanzas on the death of Mrs. Hemans. August, Landon writes a prose article about her character, and we have the bust that you can see pictured here. September, Barrett Browning's response to Landon, and then October, Landon's final poem referring to obliquely to Hemans' death. So my chapter looks at the way that New Monthly Magazine's original cut and paste obituary for Hemans from the Athenaeum, Thompson's engraving that you can see, Landon's prose essay, and Landon and Barrett Browning's elegies link the memorial issues of New Monthly Magazine on Felicia Hemans together. All 6 pieces recognize and assess the death and legacy of Felicia Hemans in a range of genres: post-mortem biography, elegy, memorial essay, appended engraving. And I argue that this chronologically compressed chain across consecutive issues for a consecutive series of half a dozen issues of New Monthly Magazine opens up critical and aesthetic possibilities for the way then that Landon and Barrett Browning in particular, alongside other genres of death writing, in the shifting markets of the 1830s, can experiment with ways to claim Hemans' status as a living author, while simultaneously debating how to participate in New Monthly Magazine's commemoration of her death. So my essay itself begins with a quick survey of the literary market in the 1820s and 30s, giving attention to what it means to be a living author. And then I walk through each of these different pieces, giving a significant amount of attention to the 2 poets at the end, and asking, how do Landon and Barrett Browning use the kind of platform that Hemans has, not only everywhere, but in New Monthly Magazine. New Monthly Magazine is deeply invested in trying to claim Hemans as their poet. So why this space? So I argue that by choosing to memorialize Felicia Hemans in New Monthly Magazine, as opposed to other places, Chambers, for example, Blackwoods, where she is publishing most at the end of her life, Letitia Landon and Elizabeth Barrett Browning capitalize on trends of periodical publication, which include the interaction between elegies and other commemorative genres, as well as the instabilities of the poetess persona. Although the 1830s still marked a very uncertain present and future for the status of poetry in England, the very uncertainty appears to have offered Landon and Barrett Browning opportunities for experimentation, including setting the elegy in dialogue with other genres that helped the poetry's contribution to assessing and defining the status of authorship and living author for poetry. So by participating in New Monthly Magazine's serial commemoration of Hemans, Letitia Landon and Barrett Browning find ways to affirm their own poetic aesthetic achievements while confirming Hemans' significance as an important female poet. So in conclusion, one of the major questions that this chapter raises is, what does it mean then for the readers of New Monthly Magazine to find so much writing about Hemans after she died? I argue that if, as Landon contends, there is, quote, a relief of expression when a poet conveys deep feelings, there seems to also be a reciprocal relief of encounter with a familiar dead poet when her name and work are evoked in the pages of a periodical that was known for printing her verse, a lot of it. So consolation seems to come first from a literary encounter with the absent dead, and then from the words of those who grieve her passing. And Landon describes this act of consolation as poetry's, quote, haunted words, which become to us even as our own words. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Betsy. What a wonderful series of chapters. I'm so grateful to all of you for your contributions to this book. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And I also want to thank Mark, Chris, Sarah, and Richard for your contributions as well to this volume. So now it is time for you as participants to ask questions. You can do that by putting a question in the chat box or by raising your hand, as Patrick just did. And Pretty and I will kind of monitor both spots to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute. Okay, so go right ahead, Patrick.
Okay, thanks. And thank all of you for a really wonderful presentation. I just thoroughly enjoyed every single one of these. Just so interesting. And I'm dying to get my hands on the book too. I had a question for Brian. Hi, Brian. I was really, I love this distinction between mirth and fun. And I'd like to hear more about that. But also, I wanted to, and this may get you slightly out of your comfort zone, I wonder if I was thinking from what you were saying about the refusal of images to be mere illustrations and the attack on words and all this. And I was thinking if there's in your work on the 1830s, is there an elegiacal quality to it so that the 1840s come to represent not the triumph of illustration, well, I guess a triumph of illustration over the autonomy of the image. Is there a sort of last hurrah aspect to the period that you're talking about?
Yes, I think it is a bit of a last hurrah, but I think you shouldn't write it too easily into the narrative of what happens. It seems to me that people get overtaken by events. It seems to me that the caricaturists in particular, what did they do? What did they do as caricatures got too expensive and people wouldn't buy them so much anymore and they didn't want to do this topical political stuff so much? What did they turn their hands to? And there is a kind of desperation about that. One narrative is clearly about desperation, I think, really. And of course, Robert Seymour is the obvious victim of that, I think, in all sorts of ways. But it's a good fight. And I think it's only, I mean, Pickwick does become such a crucial moment in relation to that. But right through the 1820s and the 1830s, a lot of comic productions really make sure that the comic image is given some autonomy and some power and can be read separately from being read with a text. And I just feel a certain affection for that narrative, really.
Thank you.
Pretty?
Thank you. And I was trying to figure out how to lower Patrick's hand, but I couldn't. So that's okay. Patrick's hand will stay up. Thank you so much. Oh my God, this is totally amazing. I can't wait to get my hand in the book either. My question sort of follows on Patrick's. And it's for Brian and Linda, but I think more broadly, because all of you, many of you, I think most of you had sort of some images in your essays or in your presentations. So I really, so Brian, one of the things you have taught me from the years of my reading your work as I enter into looking at images and illustrations is that there's an article of faith, right? That we always read illustrations, images in conversation with text, right? I mean, you can't sort of read the two asunder, and I love that this work that you're presenting is about thinking of them, of the split between image and text. And Linda, you sort of took us to the work of Buick and the tailpieces, and of course how they get used by Howitt. One of the things that, so the two sort of, it's really a comment, and I just sort of want to raise this as a set of questions more broadly. But Buick always punned, right? He called his tail pieces TAIL pieces. He said they were also TALE pieces, right? And Buick's tail pieces literally had nothing to do with the surrounding text. And to the point where when you look at different editions, this third edition or the fourth edition, that same tailpiece could be in a random other place. And Buick argued, and scholars in Buick have sort of talked about how they were tailpieces. They were each standalones that told their own story. And one of the sort of works that I have that came out, and I'm sorry that they're not here, but Beth and Stevens has this amazing book about the woodcuts of the Dalziel brothers, the proofs of the woodcuts, and because they're in these albums that are at the British Museum, they are rent of the text but they're proof. So we don't know where they appear. Many of them, some of them we recognize, but many of them we don't. And so I'm wondering, I think the larger question is what happens when we're forced to in Bethan's archive, when we're invited to in the archive Brian is talking about, or Buick, when the text image bond is broken?
I mean, my immediate response to that is to say the scrap is the classic example of this, where you decontextualize the image and put it together either with text drawn from elsewhere or the rest of it. But I think the other element in this is that very often there's an element of travesty or parody in the comic images of a kind of text-based something or other that they're taking a swipe at, really. And you actually see, for example, in the lithographs I've been looking at, they actually often parody more upmarket engravings or etchings using the same titles, A Trip to Margate or something like that. So there's that whole parodic element. But I also think the Buick tailpiece is a classic instance of an image that is separate from the text, and it's a wood engraving, and they're early for wood engravings, and they're genteel, and people see them as aesthetically ambitious and all the rest of it. And of course, that's another narrative, the attack on the aestheticizing of downmarket images too, because I think there's a self-conscious attempt to do that in all sorts of ways. So I think it's complicated.
I would just say that I think with Howitt, you were seeing precisely the fact that the two are separate. I'm a real fan of Jan's, bitextuality readings of Rossetti and so for Cuistre. So I think later on, I'm so used with the pre-Raphaelites to thinking of the tension between the text and the word. But I think she is precisely paying tribute to the fact that those tailpieces allowed for imaginative interaction with what was otherwise a very encyclopedia text on birds, right? And builds on it. The closest thing in her own poetry volume, and Alexis, I don't know if you want to show it, if you have it handy. I can't show it because my camera isn't working, but it's of a fossil elephant. And of course, there's no living being that is a fossil element. It was actually inspired by the finding of an elephant fossil in New York in, I think, 1829. So there you get that tension because you're looking at these bones that have the shape of an elephant, but there's no living animal to talk about. So in that particular case, you might have it otherwise separated. Yeah, if you can see it all, there's the fossil elephant, which is unlike any of the other ones. But I think for the most part, in her book, precisely the images are meant to be interactive with the text. They are in dialogue and they cannot, I think, be meaningfully separated. But I think that is her, as it were, skillfully adapting the illustration and illustration as such from what she would have experienced in the annuals. That's why I wanted to show you the tailpiece for The Spider and the Fly. It's got nothing to do whatsoever with that poem. Just kids flying a kite. And so I think she is doing her own innovative work with illustration and image in that one, because it goes along so well with her primary theme and teaching.
Maybe if I could jump in, since Pretty said the question was more global. I work with this a little bit in my chapter, and actually the paper I gave at Sterling was just focused on that bust alone, that the image, the engraving of the bust, and how it is announced by the editors to go with Landon's essay about Hemmings. But images have this rebellious streak, as Brian was saying, they push back, right? And they have this power to kind of globally migrate around bounded works. They don't have page numbers. They don't have some of these disciplinary structures that text does in periodical form. And so when I was trying to figure out what page this bust actually showed up on, the bound volumes that I checked out, depending on the library, the bust was in a different location. And so it was next to different text all the time. And I, 4 different locations where it was. And so I spent some time in the chapter thinking about what does it mean for an image to migrate and sit by different text? How does it change how this commemorative work is working for Hemmings? If it's at the very front of the whole bound periodical, how is that different than sitting next to just a specific prose piece? So another example of these images changing their meaning as they stand alone or stand next to text.
Do any of our other presenters want to jump in there? We have another question. Some of you mentioned that you were dying to get your hands on the book, and I'm going to put in the chat a link to the UP page along with the discount in case if you'd like to purchase a copy. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex next for your question.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question for Françoise about the Compositors magazine. Did you find any material in the magazine related to being a compositor for foreign languages, languages other than English, that is, or for non-Roman scripts? I thought this could be an interesting angle to approach the issue of multilingualism in 19th century periodicals from.
Thank you very much. Not yet, not really. There's as far as I know, as far as I found, there are some references to foreign works of art. There are some references to, but not properly speaking, to languages. I wrote something on, more in political pieces, first of all, and there I focused more on poems. There are some, among the poems, there are some poems reprinted from foreign magazines. So there was a poem from a French magazine from the 1830s, but that's not very much about it's really, just reprinted, but it's not, I did not find, but I still have a lot of work to do on that because it's so rich and there are also readers' contributions, but I didn't find anything very convincing, on a reflection on language.
Other questions, please just raise your hand or jump right in if you have one, or you can raise your virtual hand. While you're thinking, I have a question that I will ask of all the panelists. I love how Betsy concluded her presentation by saying that there were lots of questions raised by her work that she hoped to address and that others would address in the future. And given that this period, there's so much, yet to be said about this moment in media history, like, what are the questions for you? What are the new directions? Sophia, you just nodded your head. So would you start us off here?
Yes, thank you. I shouldn't have nodded my head because now I'm nervous. No, this is something that I think about a lot in terms of my project. This essay is part of a larger project that looks at the anti-slavery reporter through a geographic lens, and I am very excited by the idea of reading periodicals as the anti-slavery reporter specifically, but really periodicals from this particular period as textual geographies, and thinking about the ways that they function as technologies of empire, how the form of the periodical has this geographic component and how it helps position the readers within this. So, like, for me, the 20s and 30s are the most interesting time period because so much is in flux and so much is changing, and the world at the time was really going through a major transformation, and thinking about how the act of reading periodicals and of creating periodicals in just the periodical form as like instrumental to this transformation of the world, and really how that is very similar to our current time period and this rapid transformation of media and how and the tumultuous political state of the world. So to answer your question, I would love to think about how this applies more broadly to the field of periodical studies.
Helena, I wonder if you have some thoughts about open questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you know, in the beginnings of the chapter, and I know you've done this in your own work, I'm sort of talking about, you know, that it wasn't in fact unusual to start young, right? That there were lots of in fact authors that are being mentioned a lot, but as I'm starting to move towards a project on children's literature, you know, I've also got this idea in my head of what does it mean to be a child author, which I feel is kind of a way of looking at some of these authors that I've kind of not thought about before. So this is kind of a different frame for thinking about, you know, there's been quite a bit of work on should we talk about the teen in the Victorian period or not, because you know it's a kind of an emergent concept. So very much a kind of very very new thought for me is thinking about the child author as well as kind of fiction for children, because Craik is obviously one of these writers who starts her writing life as a arguably child, and quite quickly, you know, one of her first novels is for children, but she's still a, you know, again, depending on where you kind of see childhood as ending in the Victorian period, if you're going for criminal age of responsibility, it's quite young. But so yeah, so I'm the new project for me is thinking about children's literature, and some of my interest there is around what does it mean to be a kind of a young author, YA for the Victorians. Sorry, it was a bit garbled.
Thank you very much. Kaylee, I wonder if you came up with any questions during your research on this chapter that you think might inspire other scholars or inform your own work.
For me, it was thinking about the culture of reprinting, specifically in the UK, because I could find lots of scholarship that's been done on reprinting in American periodicals and publications, but I was really, and it could just have been my search terms, struggling to find really robust discussion of the actual recirculation and what was happening. And I didn't want to get too deep into the weeds of copyright legislation. So that might be something that I want to, those are questions that were raised for me in kind of the deeper understanding of the culture of reprinting, specifically among British periodicals in the early 19th century. And then thinking about the recirculation of someone like Hughes, I'm hopefully in the future working on a project on Emily of New Moon, which is a Canadian children's novel by Ellen Montgomery. And in it, the main character wants to be a poetess, and Hughes is mentioned quite a lot. And so I'm just kind of wanting to think about, again, that recirculation in colonial spaces of her poetry, and what that all means for modeling poetics for a kind of colonial girlhood audience. So those are kind of some of the paths that writing the chapter took me.
Yeah, I'm really interested in those questions too. Absolutely. So much work to be done. Jennie, your chapter was really influential in my thinking about media ecology, and the way that rival titles would respond to each other and change the shape of the genre over time. And yeah, so do you have further thoughts about kind of a next step for us as scholars in this investigation?
Thank you. That's really kind. I mean, I think a lot about that, and I think about how hard it is to do that work. So I think a lot about what methodologies can we use, what resources we might need, what collaborations we need to facilitate to make that kind of work happen. Because a lot of the work that I've done so far in that, and I'm aware I've just scratched a surface of a corner of this kind of field, really has just been through slogging through and kind of reading things simultaneously and going, well, this is what's happening in 1819 in this magazine, this is what's happening in Blackwoods, this is what's happening. And that's, that's fascinating work, and it's a slog, and it's quite difficult to kind of piece together. So yeah, I'm very interested in trying to map those connections discursively, digitally, and to think about how we can think about periodicals more sort of synchronically. But I guess the other thing, I mean, while you were just asking other contributors what questions they have, I mean, the other thing for me, and I guess part of this, for me, the process of rethinking that writing this chapter enabled me to do, is really just a sort of a kind of meta question I have, which I guess we should all be more preoccupied with than many of us are, because we work in periods and fields and departments that have particular chronologies, is what happens when the 1820s to the 1840s, or any other 3 or 2 decade period, becomes the beginning or the middle or the end of a particular kind of line of research inquiry. And I guess partly why I thought the way I did think about this period when I initially began my work on periodicals is because it was the end, right? It was the end of the story I was trying to tell. And the thing that was so invigorating for me about the opportunity to write this chapter was, it's like, okay, what if I don't think about this as the end? I'm not exactly thinking about it as a beginning, because like there's a preface at least there to this, so it's not exactly a beginning, but if it's a middle, what the heck is it a middle of? So I mean, the very language of transition and some of the other vocabulary that you so very helpfully agitate for us, Alexis, in the fabulous introduction to the book, is something that I'm really thinking a lot about at the moment, and thinking about thinking about periodization, and thinking about the hold that periodization has over the narratives it's been possible for us to tell about the field that we work in. So I have just lots of questions about that. So I'm sort of torn. On the one hand, I guess this is what happens when you work on periodicals, right? Like my thinking is always kind of, I want to do more sort of work horizontally, and I want to do more work vertically, and I want to know when I really just want to shake all of that up. I guess it's not particularly helpful, but these are the kind of things that preoccupy me at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Betsy, Francoise, Linda, or Brian, do you want to jump in and share your thoughts about sort of open questions?
The one about periodization, I think about that a lot. When I started working on graphic material, I was very, very influenced by Louis James' Print and the People, 1819, 1851. And I thought, that's a very interesting kind of starting and finishing point. And there's a lot inside there.
My own would be a little bit more authorially based. And it's something that Helena is talking about, the ability of the individual contributor to negotiate and mediate periodicals, to find a place and to create a place. I think so much more needs to be done with Mary Howitt. I hope to return to her sometime. I mean, how many people know she was the most popular poet in America after Hemans died? How many people know she edited Fisher's drawing room scrapbook after LEL died? I mean, she was just all over the place, and she doesn't seem to get recognition. She's not even on Laura Mandel's Poetess Archive page, although she contributed so often. But that idea of being able to insert oneself and to find a place, I'm thinking of Mary Howitt sending the co-written poem she wrote with her husband, The Desolation of Iam, set in Pennsylvania, as I recall. She sends a copy to America, and that's where her transatlantic reputation begins to take off. She was immensely popular in America. I'm now working on Amy Levy, trying to do a hybrid cultural and personal biography. I'm so fascinated with Helena's point because Amy Levy was 13 when she had her first poem published, but she was always so strategic about jumping in as a new periodical arose and strategically making use of it and finding a way to insert herself in it. So that's the micro level, I realize, as opposed to these wonderful, brilliant macro level ideas that I'm hearing from all my colleagues here.
Alexis, can I jump in? I'm not a speaker, but I wanted to sort of add to Jenny's wonderful comment about how periodicals help us rethink periodization, which there's a number of comments on in the chat. And I'll just throw in that another thing that helps me rethink periodization is, of course, colonies, which Sophia's work, the colonial, which Sophia's work centralized, talked about. But when you start thinking from the perspective of enslavement or colonial questions, and here I'm really thinking of the work of somebody that I wish were here, but has given an RSVP digital talk, but Tom Young, who's a wonderful art historian who focuses on lithographs, actually, of that were and watercolors that were done in India by British colonial officers. And when you come from that perspective, all of our sort of regular periodization, or also periodization of romantics versus, literary periodization, just goes out the window, right? Because suddenly the moment that becomes important is 1813, because that's the moment in which missionaries were allowed into India. The East India Company allowed missionaries, or not the company, the parliament. So really different stories get told when you think through periodicals and when you think through periodicals of empire in particular. So I just want to throw that out there.
Like, I just would like to agree with what has been said about periodization and time and space. I mean, working on periodicals, we think about, Priti was talking about circulations, about particular moments, ways of understanding text and images according to place, but also their circulation. And working on this chapter, I've been thinking also about, from the printing room to the page. So this is also another perspective. I really delved into working conditions, thinking about working conditions. This is also one of the forthcoming projects. I've got these projects on the Punch's Pocket book, very kindly supported by RSVP. And this also involves looking at, what is visible on the page and what is behind the page, and also what circulates around the page. You were talking, Priti, about, images circulating. You were talking about tailpieces and tailpieces. And I think in the pocket book, sorry, I'm slowly moving into the pocket books, but this is also something which is happening. So I think that working on periodicals really allows us to, to think wider, larger. And I think that's, I'm very grateful for that.
Well, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, and I want to just take a moment to thank Priti and to thank Fionnuala for all of your work in making this happen, and the Digital Events Committee as well. And I, of course, want to thank 1,000 times those of you who contributed to this volume. And I hope that all of you who are here today will read it. And I'm pleased to announce that it's going to be available on Edinburgh Scholarship Online if your library subscribes to that database. So it'll be searchable. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here, and I wish you all a wonderful end of summer.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. To Alexis for putting this together and managing this so well. 7 speakers, was quite a task, and you did it beautifully. And thank you all very, very much. I'll just quickly take this moment to say that we have another book launch coming up in about 2 weeks. Friday, September 13th. It's not Friday the 13th, don't think of it that way. It's on September 13th. We have Mary Shannon's wonderful new book about Billy Waters, and Teja Varma Puspati's book. And Teja is here, I see, on amongst other writers, Harriet Martineau. So that's on September 13th. And then on October 11th, we have another, it's I'm calling it a part book launch, but Leslie Howsam is here. Leslie has a book about Eliza Orme, and this is not just about the book, but it's picking up on a chapter from the book. And Leslie is actually, I haven't put it out yet, so you all won't see, but I'm going to just tell you that Leslie's picking up on that work, and her title is A Challenge to Periodical Studies. So Leslie's talk is going to be a discussion of her book, drawing on it, and also asking us some difficult, big methodological questions. So that's on October 11th. So thank you all so much for your continued support of RSVP and digital events.